Your badge is not a shield from accountability, she told them. It's a symbol of public trust. Every day, you have the power to either strengthen or weaken that trust. Choose wisely. In the back of the room, the commissioner watched proudly as his wife helped shape the next generation of officers. What had started as a terrible incident had transformed into an opportunity for real, lasting change. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm. Traffic stops still happened, but they were different now, more professional, more respectful, more focused on public safety than power. Officers' cameras recorded everything, not as a threat, but as a tool for accountability and improvement. The story of Officer Wilson and Dr. Chen was still taught at the academy, but not as a cautionary tale of individual misconduct. Instead, it was presented as a turning point, the moment when a department chose to transform itself to better serve its community, to live up to its motto of protect and serve. As the sun set on another day in a reformed department, a new shift of officers headed out to patrol. Their badges still shone in the evening light, but they carried something more valuable than authority. They carried the community's renewed trust and the responsibility to keep earning it every single day. 6 months had passed since Officer Wilson's sentencing, and the police department looked different now. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the training center, where a new batch of officers sat attentively, watching body camera footage from past incidents, learning what to do and, more importantly, what not to do. Dr. Chen stood at the front of the room, her white doctor's coat exchanged for a blazer as she led the training session. Her story had become a cornerstone of the department's new approach to community policing, but she wasn't there to dwell on the past. She was there to shape the future. Being a police officer isn't just about enforcing laws, she explained, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. It's about protecting people's dignity, their rights, their humanity. Every traffic stop, every interaction is a chance to either build trust or break it. The changes weren't just in training. Walking through the station, you could see the difference. Body cameras were now checked 3 times per shift, with any malfunction resulting in immediate investigation. The complaint filing process had been simplified, made more accessible, with each report tracked and investigated thoroughly. In the commissioner's office, the wall that once held commendations now displayed statistics, response times, complaint resolutions, community feedback scores. But most importantly, it showed the declining number of use of force incidents since the new policies took effect. The numbers tell a story, the commissioner explained to a visiting official from another city. When officers are properly trained, properly monitored, and properly held accountable, everyone benefits, the police and the community alike. Down in the records department, transparency had become the new normal. Civilian oversight committees regularly reviewed body camera footage, complaint investigations were conducted by independent teams, and quarterly reports were made public. The change wasn't just within the department. Out on the streets, officers were building new relationships with the communities they served. Coffee with a Cop programs had expanded, community feedback sessions were held monthly, and officers were required to spend time volunteering in their patrol areas. Remember when people used to cross the street when they saw us coming? A veteran officer mentioned during a shift change. Now they wave, they stop to chat. It's like we're part of the community again, not just policing it. The Oversight Committee, now expanded and empowered, met regularly in a glass-walled conference room, transparency in both policy and practice. Dr. Chen's medical background had proved invaluable in developing new approaches to mental health calls and crisis intervention. We're seeing a 40% reduction in escalated encounters, reported one analyst during a committee meeting. Officers are taking more time, using more de-escalation techniques, finding better solutions. In the hospital, Dr. Chen's story had inspired changes too. The emergency department had developed better protocols for treating victims of police misconduct, ensuring both medical care and proper documentation. But these days, those protocols were rarely needed. The former food truck vendor who'd recorded the original incident was now a regular participant in community police forums. His video had helped spark change, but he stayed involved to help maintain it. It's not enough to just catch bad behavior, he often said. We need to encourage good behavior too. Even the physical space of the police station had transformed. The walls now displayed community artwork, photos from neighborhood events, and posters emphasizing service over force. The intimidating barrier between the front desk and the public had been replaced with a more open, welcoming design. 1 year to the day after the incident, Dr. Chen stood in front of a graduating class of new officers. These recruits had gone through the reformed training program, learning not just law enforcement techniques, but empathy, cultural awareness, and the true meaning of public service. Wilson's attorney offered little defense. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too established, the damage too widespread. Instead, he focused on negotiating the terms of accountability. Cooperation with ongoing investigations in exchange for consideration during sentencing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, the judge prepared to announce his decision. The courtroom fell silent, years of unchecked power and privilege about to meet justice. This court has a responsibility, the judge began, not just to punish wrongdoing, but to send a clear message about accountability. No badge, no uniform, no position of authority places anyone above the law. The sentence was comprehensive: prison time, financial restitution to victims, permanent revocation of law enforcement certification. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of real change in the department. Outside, as the news spread, there were no celebrations, no cheering crowds. Instead, there was a quiet sense of relief, of justice served, of a system finally working the way it should. This case wasn't just about punishing one officer, it was about transforming an entire department's culture. Dr. Chen and the commissioner left the courthouse hand in hand, their work far from over. Tomorrow would bring more reforms, more training, more steps toward rebuilding trust between police and community. But today, at least, justice had been served. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on the morning of Officer Wilson's hearing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps as photographers jostled for position, their cameras ready to capture what had become the city's most talked-about case. Inside, the hallway outside Courtroom 3 was equally packed. Civil rights attorneys huddled with their clients, people who'd finally found the courage to speak up about their encounters with Wilson. Some had traveled from other cities after seeing Dr. Chen's story on the news. "All rise," called the bailiff as the judge entered. Wilson stood at the defendant's table, his police uniform replaced by a plain gray suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. 2 weeks of investigations and revelations had taken their toll. His face was gaunt, his eyes haunted. The prosecutor approached the podium, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, we're prepared to present evidence of 37 separate incidents spanning 5 years. The pattern of misconduct is undeniable." In the gallery, Dr. Chen sat with her husband, the commissioner. She'd taken the morning off from surgery to be here, her presence a silent reminder of the incident that had finally brought Wilson's actions to light. "The investigation has revealed a disturbing pattern," the prosecutor continued, gesturing to the stack of files before her. "Traffic stops escalated without cause. Body cameras conveniently malfunctioning. Reports falsified to justify aggressive behavior." Wilson's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The evidence was overwhelming. Even the police union, usually quick to defend its officers, had distanced itself from this case. The security footage from the night he'd assaulted Dr. Chen played on the courtroom screen, the images stark and undeniable. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. They weren't angry protesters. Instead, they were citizens holding signs calling for police reform, for accountability, for change. Many were former victims of similar incidents, finding strength in numbers and the promise of justice. Back in the courtroom, more evidence was presented. Former partners testified about Wilson's behavior, their voices heavy with regret for not speaking up sooner. Internal affairs investigators detailed their findings: years of complaints buried, warnings ignored, red flags overlooked. "The dashboard camera footage tells a clear story," explained the tech expert, pointing to the screen. Officer Wilson's camera was disabled an average of 3 times per shift, always during traffic stops, always with certain types of citizens. Wilson slumped further in his chair as his own records were used against him. Each piece of evidence stripped away another layer of deniability, another excuse, another justification for his actions. At the police station, officers gathered around televisions in the break room, watching the live coverage. The case had sparked intense discussions about power, responsibility, and the true meaning of protecting and serving. "I had no idea it was this bad," whispered a rookie officer, shaking her head as another victim testified. "How do we make sure this never happens again?" The answer was already taking shape. In the commissioner's office, a team was finalizing new policies, mandatory body camera checks, immediate investigation of all complaints, enhanced training programs focused on de-escalation and bias awareness. Dr. Chen's role on the oversight committee had expanded. Her experience, combined with her medical background, brought a unique perspective to police reform. "We need to heal the relationship between law enforcement and the community," she'd said in a recent meeting. "Trust has to be rebuilt from the ground up." Back in the courtroom, the judge listened intently as victim after victim shared their stories. People who'd been afraid to speak up before found their voices, supported by a system finally ready to listen. The defendant's actions represent more than just individual misconduct, the prosecutor argued. They represent a failure of the system meant to prevent exactly this kind of abuse of power. "Your dash cam was turned off 13 times last month alone," the investigator noted, sliding another report across the table. Can to explain why. Wilson's mouth went dry. The same excuses he used for years sounded hollow now, even to his own ears. The weight of his actions, the lives he'd impacted, the trust he'd betrayed, it all came crashing down at once. Tays started falling before he could stop them. Years of built-up arrogance, prejudice, and abuse of power dissolved into quiet sobs. The tough cop who'd terrorized so many broke down completely, his carefully constructed world shattered beyond repair. Outside the interview room, the station continued its daily rhythm. But something had changed. The thin blue line that had protected officers like Wilson for so long was being redrawn, with accountability and justice on the other side. As the sun set on another day at the precinct, Wilson sat alone in the interview room, finally writing out his full confession. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of his career, but also like a step towards something that had eluded him for years: the truth. The precinct locker room felt suffocating as Officer Wilson sat alone on the wooden bench, his head in his hands. The meeting in the commissioner's office had ended hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. His once pristine uniform felt heavy on his shoulders, the badge that had given him so much power now weighing like lead against his chest. From outside, he could hear the usual bustle of the station, but it sounded different now. Officers who used to greet him warmly passed by without a word. The familiar sounds of radio chatter and ringing phones felt distant, as if he was already separated from this world he'd been part of for so long. "Your preliminary hearing is tomorrow at 9 a.m., Detective Lee had told him, her voice professional but cold. The stack of evidence files she'd shown him told a story he couldn't deny anymore, a story of power abused, trust betrayed, and lives impacted. His phone buzzed again, the 15th time in the past hour. This time, he forced himself to look at the screen. It was a news notification. Breaking. Police officer's history of misconduct revealed. Multiple victims come forward. The room started spinning. Wilson stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before his breakfast came up. Looking in the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The arrogant officer who'd terrorized innocent civilians was gone, replaced by a pale, sweating man whose career, and possibly freedom, hung by a thread. Outside his sanctuary, the investigation was gaining momentum. The commissioner had ordered all of Wilson's past cases to be reviewed. In the detective's bullpen, officers worked overtime, combing through years of traffic stops, arrests, and civilian complaints. "Look at this pattern," one detective said, spreading papers across his desk. "Every Friday night, same neighborhood, same type of stops. How did nobody notice this before?" Wilson's former partner sat in an interview room, providing testimony that cut deep into Wilson's carefully constructed facade. He called it teaching them respect. The partner revealed, shame evident in his voice. "I should have reported it sooner. I'm sorry." In the break room, younger officers discussed the case in hushed tones. Many had looked up to Wilson once, seeing him as a model of assertive policing. Now they saw him as a cautionary tale, an example of everything wrong with the system they'd sworn to uphold. "I'd always thought something was off," a rookie officer admitted, stirring her coffee mindlessly. But who was going to believe a first-year cop over someone with his reputation? Back in the locker room, Wilson's phone buzzed again. This time it was his wife. The kids are asking questions. The news is everywhere. What should I tell them? His hands shook as he tried to type a response, but what could he say? How could he explain to his children that their father, who had taught them about right and wrong, had become the very thing he claimed to protect them from? The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. 2 internal affairs officers stood in the doorway, their faces grim. "Officer Wilson, we need you to come with us. There are some additional questions about your cases from last summer." As he followed them through the station, Wilson felt every eye on him. Officers he'd worked with for years suddenly found their paperwork fascinating. The desk sergeant, who used to save him the best donuts, wouldn't meet his gaze. In the commissioner's office, Dr. Chen's photo seemed to watch him from the desk. She had already turned this incident into something positive, pushing for departmental reforms, better training, and stricter oversight. Meanwhile, he was drowning in the consequences of his actions. The internal affairs interview room felt smaller than ever. The walls seemed to close in as they showed him video after video, complaint after complaint. Each piece of evidence stripped away another layer of his denials, his excuses, his self-justification. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but Wilson felt cold. The office that had once been a place of commendation and respect now felt like a courtroom, with every award on the wall, every certificate, every photo serving as a silent witness to his disgrace. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably another message from the police union representative. They'd been unusually quiet about his case, a telling sign in itself. The usual brotherhood of silence was fracturing, leaving him increasingly isolated. "Officer Wilson," the commissioner leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "I want you to understand something. This isn't just about my wife. This isn't even just about you anymore. This is about every officer who thinks a badge gives them the right to abuse their power. This is about every citizen who's lost faith in those sworn to protect them." Wilson slumped in his chair, the full weight of his actions finally hitting him. Through the office windows, he could see the city sprawling out before him, the same streets he'd patrolled, the same communities he'd sworn to serve and protect. How many lives had he impacted? How many people had he traumatized? The commissioner stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow across the desk. "Internal Affairs has some more questions for you. After that, we'll be reviewing every complaint, every traffic stop, every incident you've been involved in. Every single one." As if on cue, more investigators filed into the office, each carrying files and tablets. Wilson watched them enter, his career, his future, his carefully constructed world of power and impunity crumbling before his eyes. The family photo still sat on the desk, a silent witness to his downfall. Dr. Chen's smile seemed to carry a different meaning now, not of victory or revenge, but of justice finally being served. The system he'd manipulated for so long was finally turning its attention to him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Officer Wilson trudged through the station's hallways, his footsteps heavy with resentment. 3 days had passed since the incident, and he'd been called in for what they said was a mandatory meeting about departmental policies. He straightened his uniform, still clinging to his pride despite the whispers that followed him through the building. The commissioner's office door stood before him, its polished nameplate gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He'd been here before, usually for commendations or routine meetings, but today felt different. The usual chatter of the precinct seemed muted, and even the morning sunlight streaming through the windows felt cold. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Officer Wilson opened the door, his practiced confident stride carrying him into the spacious office. The morning light poured through the large windows, illuminating the various awards and certificates on the walls. The commissioner wasn't alone. A senior internal affairs investigator sat in one of the chairs, her notepad ready. Wilson's eyes wandered around the room, taking in the familiar surroundings, the filing cabinets, the city maps on the walls. His gaze froze on the commissioner's desk. There, in a simple silver frame, stood a family photo. His heart seemed to stop as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The woman in the photo, smiling beside the commissioner, wearing a doctor's white coat, was unmistakable. It was her. The woman he'd pulled over. The woman he'd. The color drained from his face as the pieces fell into place. The commissioner watched him silently, noting the exact moment of recognition. Wilson's legs felt weak, and he gripped the back of the chair in front of him for support. "Please, sit down," the commissioner said, his voice carefully neutral. Wilson collapsed into the chair, his mind racing through the events of that rainy night, seeing them in a horrifying new light. "I believe you've met my wife," the commissioner continued, turning the photo slightly so it faced Wilson more directly. "Though your encounter the other night wasn't exactly a proper introduction." Wilson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The family photo seemed to mock him, the commissioner and his wife at a hospital charity gala, both of them beaming with accomplishment and dignity. The same woman he treated with such unwarranted aggression. "Sir, Wilson started, but his voice cracked. What could he possibly say? How could he explain away his actions now? The Internal Affairs investigator cleared her throat softly. "Officer Wilson, we've been reviewing your body camera footage from the past 6 months." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Or rather, we've been reviewing the times when your camera was conveniently turned off." More photos appeared on the desk. Printouts from traffic cam footage, witness statements, a thick file of civilian complaints. Wilson's eyes darted between them, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "Dr. Chen, my wife, is not just a renowned neurosurgeon," the commissioner continued, his voice still eerily calm. "She's also the newest member of our police oversight committee. She was appointed last month." Each word felt like another nail in Wilson's career coffin. He remembered the surgeon's coat she'd been wearing that night, the hospital ID badge he'd ignored in his blind rage. How many lives had she saved in that operating room while he'd been out harassing innocent citizens? "We've received 23 new complaints since the incident," the Internal Affairs investigator added, flipping through her notes. "All with similar patterns. All during your shifts. All during conveniently unrecorded traffic stops." Dr. Chen received updates throughout the day as she worked at the hospital. Between surgeries, she reviewed new policies being proposed, adding her own suggestions based on her experience. Her incident had become a turning point, a catalyst for change that was long overdue. As evening approached, Detective Lee sat at her desk, surrounded by witness statements and evidence files. She looked at the photo of Dr. Chen taken right after the incident, then at the growing wall of similar cases. The pattern was undeniable, the need for change obvious. The commissioner made one final round of the investigation room before heading home. The team would work through the night, processing evidence, taking statements, building a case that would lead to not just one officer's removal, but to fundamental changes in department policy. Outside, news vans still lined the street, their lights illuminating the growing darkness. This story had captured the public's attention, but unlike many others, this one would have real consequences. This time, change wasn't just a promise, it was becoming reality. The investigation was far from over, but already it had revealed more than just one officer's misconduct. It had exposed the cracks in the system, the failures in oversight, and the culture that allowed such behavior to persist. But it had also shown that change was possible when people stood together and demanded better. As night fell on the city, the lights in the investigation room stayed on. This wasn't just about justice for one incident anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to experience what Dr. Chen and countless others had endured. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in years, real change seemed possible. The police department's conference room had never felt so tense. Files were spread across the long table, each one containing a different complaint against Officer Wilson. Detective Lee stood at the front of the room, pinning photos and documents to a large board, creating a timeline that grew more disturbing with each edition. "Let's start from the beginning," she said, addressing the room full of Internal Affairs investigators. Last night's incident opened a floodgate. People who were afraid to come forward before are speaking up now. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting lines of light across the evidence board. Each ray illuminated a different photo, a different story, a different victim who had faced similar treatment from the same officer. In the corner, a young officer was updating the complaint database. "That's the 20th case this morning," she announced, her voice tight with disbelief. Most of them from the past 3 years, all with a similar pattern. The police commissioner sat quietly at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled anger as he reviewed each new report. His wife's incident had triggered an avalanche of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Down in the records department, two clerks worked frantically to dig up every traffic stop Officer Wilson had conducted in the past 5 years. The numbers were telling their own story. A clear pattern of targeting specific groups, escalating simple traffic violations into confrontational situations. "Look at this," one clerk called out, holding up a file. 3 complaints in 1 week, all dismissed without investigation. How did we miss this? Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Officer Wilson's former partners were being interviewed one by one. The wall of silence that typically protected officers was crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. "I requested a transfer after 2 weeks with him," admitted one officer, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "The way he treated people during routine stops, I knew something bad would happen eventually." Another partner spoke about trying to report Wilson's behavior through proper channels. "The complaints would disappear," she explained, her voice heavy with regret. "After a while, you felt helpless to stop it." In the hospital, Dr. Chen was reviewing her case with the Police Oversight Committee. The bruise on her face had faded, but her determination hadn't. She listened as committee members discussed policy changes that could prevent similar incidents. "Body cameras should never be disabled," insisted one committee member, tapping his pen against the table. "And any officer with multiple complaints needs immediate review, not just a note in their file." Back at the station, the investigation team had set up a hotline for new complaints. The phones hadn't stopped ringing since morning. Each call revealed another piece of the puzzle, another incident that should have raised red flags years ago. "We've got security footage from a gas station," announced Detective Lee, walking into the conference room with a USB drive. "From 3 months ago. Same officer, similar situation, different victim." The commissioner called for a department-wide meeting. The usually noisy assembly hall fell silent as officers filed in, the gravity of the situation visible on every face. This wasn't just about one officer anymore, it was about the entire system that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. "We're looking at complete reform," the commissioner stated, his voice echoing through the hall. "New training protocols, stricter oversight, immediate investigation of all complaints. This ends now." In the break room, younger officers discussed the changes among themselves. Many had witnessed Wilson's behavior but felt powerless to speak up. The culture of silence was breaking down, replaced by a growing determination to do better. The day wore on, and the evidence continued to mount. Security footage, witness statements, documentation of escalated traffic stops, each piece adding to the overwhelming case against Officer Wilson, but more importantly, each piece highlighted the systemic failures that needed to be addressed. By afternoon, more stories had started emerging. Other citizens began coming forward with their own accounts of encounters with Officer Wilson. A pattern was forming, a disturbing history of similar incidents that had been swept under the rug. The police union representatives sat in a tense meeting, reviewing the mounting evidence. Usually quick to defend their officers, even they could see this case was indefensible. The video evidence was too clear, the witness statements too consistent, and Dr. Chen's professional reputation too sterling to ignore. "We've received the formal complaint," announced the Internal Affairs Chief to his team. Along with supporting statements from 7 witnesses, security camera footage from 2 angles, and 3 civilian videos. The convenience store owner just dropped off his footage as well. In the hospital cafeteria, Dr. Chen sat with her surgical team during a brief lunch break. They were discussing an upcoming procedure when a nurse rushed in with her phone. The local news was running a special report. Officer Wilson's previous complaints were being unsealed. The number was staggering. 5 years on the force, the reporter said on screen, and 17 complaints filed. None fully investigated until now. Dr. Chen watched the report quietly, her salad forgotten. She remembered the fear in her heart last night, the helplessness she'd felt for those few moments. But she also remembered the immediate support from bystanders, the quick response from witnesses, and the overwhelming support she'd received since. Her phone lit up with a message from Detective Lee. They needed her to come back to the station to review additional evidence. As she gathered her things, her team stood with her in solidarity. "We've got your afternoon surgeries covered," Dr. Chen, her senior resident, assured her. "This is important too." As she walked through the hospital corridors, staff members nodded in support. The incident had shaken their community, but it had also united them. Dr. Chen knew that her experience, though traumatic, would serve a greater purpose. The system needed change, and sometimes change needed a catalyst. The rain had started again as she drove back to the police station, but unlike last night, she didn't feel alone or vulnerable. She felt empowered, supported, and most importantly, determined to make sure this incident led to real, lasting change in the department. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident anymore. It was about addressing a systemic issue, about standing up for everyone who'd ever felt powerless during a police encounter. As Dr. Chen parked her car at the station, she knew that the real work was just beginning. The next morning, the police station buzzed with unusual activity. Dr. Chen sat in a quiet interview room, her hospital ID badge still pinned to her white coat from her morning rounds. Her cheek showed a faint bruise, a reminder of last night's encounter. She had just finished giving her statement to Internal Affairs, her voice never wavering as she recounted every detail. Outside the interview room, phones were ringing nonstop. The video from last night had spread like wildfire across social media. The food truck vendor's shaky footage had already reached 1 million views, while the young couple's clearer recording was being played on local news stations. Each video showed the same thing, an officer clearly abusing his power. "Would you like some water, Dr. Chen?" asked Detective Lee, sliding a bottle across the table. She had been taking notes for the past hour, her face growing more concerned with each detail of the incident. "Thank you," Dr. Chen replied, her professional demeanor intact despite the circumstances. She hadn't slept much, but she'd still performed 2 surgeries that morning. Her patients needed her, regardless of what had happened. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Officer Wilson sat nervously in his supervisor's office. His usual cocky attitude had disappeared as he watched the viral videos play on the lieutenant's computer screen. His hastily written report from last night sat on the desk, its lies now glaringly obvious when compared to the video evidence. 3 different camera angles, the lieutenant said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The convenience store security footage is particularly clear. Would you like to revise your statement about Dr. Chen being aggressive and non-compliant?" Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The weight of his actions was finally starting to sink in. His phone had been buzzing all morning with messages from fellow officers, none of them supportive. The thin blue line he always counted on was quickly disappearing. Back in the hospital, Dr. Chen's colleagues had rallied around her. The chief of surgery had personally rearranged her schedule to accommodate the police investigation. Her nursing staff had brought her coffee and breakfast, their usual professional relationship warming into something more personal and supportive. Dr. Chen called out one of her residents as she walked through the hospital corridor. "The news is saying you're pressing charges. Is it true?" She paused, considering her response carefully. "This isn't just about me," she finally said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her phone buzzed again, another message from her husband. He was in back-to-back meetings about the incident, but had made sure to check on her throughout the day. The support was touching, but Dr. Chen knew this was bigger than just her case now. The rain pounded against the windshield as Chen made her way home from another exhausting 12-hour shift at City Memorial Hospital. The clock on her dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and all she could think about was getting home to her warm bed. Her surgical scrubs were still underneath her coat. She hadn't even had time to change after her last emergency surgery. The streets were nearly empty in this part of downtown, with only the occasional car passing by and the rhythmic sound of her wipers breaking the silence. The traffic light ahead turned yellow, and she carefully slowed to a stop, drumming her fingers on the steering wheel as she waited. Blue and red lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Chen checked her speedometer, confused. She knew she hadn't been speeding. She guided her silver Honda to the curb, making sure to signal properly. Following the protocol she knew all too well, she turned off the engine, placed her hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Officer Wilson approached her window, his flashlight beam nearly blinding her as he shone it directly into her face. Even before he spoke, something felt off about his demeanor. His jaw was clenched, and his free hand was already resting on his belt in an unnecessarily aggressive stance. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with the usual greeting. Chen noticed he wasn't wearing his body camera, a direct violation of department policy. "Of course, officer," she replied calmly, keeping her voice steady despite her growing unease. "May I reach for my purse in the passenger seat?" Without waiting for his response, she slowly moved her hand toward her bag. That's when things escalated. Officer Wilson yanked her door open, grabbing her arm roughly. "I didn't say you could move," he shouted, his face contorted with unnecessary anger. "Officer, I was just reaching for my—" Chen's explanation was cut short by a sharp slap across her face, the sound echoing in the quiet street. Her head snapped to the side, her cheek stinging from the impact. The few bystanders who were around gasped in shock. A young couple across the street had already pulled out their phones, recording the incident. A nearby food truck vendor stepped closer, calling out, "Hey, that's not right." Chen touched her cheek in disbelief, her medical ID badge from the hospital catching the streetlight as her hand moved. She was still wearing her surgical jacket with Dr. Chen embroidered on the pocket, the same jacket she'd worn earlier that day while saving lives in the operating room. Officer Wilson seemed to falter for a split second when he noticed her professional attire, but his arrogance quickly returned. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his voice dripping with unwarranted authority. Chen remained remarkably composed, her years of handling high-pressure situations in the OR helping her stay calm. She knew every word, every action was being recorded by the witnesses around her. She also knew that somewhere in her wallet was her police commissioner's card, the same commissioner she had dinner with just last weekend, along with her husband. "Officer Wilson," she said clearly, making sure to read his nameplate, "I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." Her voice was steady, professional, carrying the same authority she used when directing her surgical team. The rain continued to fall around them, the flashing police lights creating an eerie dance of red and blue on the wet pavement. More cars were slowing down now, their occupants watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, capturing everything. Little did Officer Wilson know, but this rainy night would mark the beginning of his downfall. The woman he had just assaulted wasn't just any citizen, she was Dr. Chen, head of neurosurgery at City Memorial, wife of the police commissioner, and newly appointed member of the city's police oversight committee. The security camera from the convenience store across the street had captured everything. The food truck vendor was already dialing the police station's non-emergency number, and the young couple's video was moments away from being uploaded to social media. In his blind rage and prejudice, Officer Wilson had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Chen's phone lit up with a message. It was her husband asking where she was. She smiled slightly, knowing that very soon, Officer Wilson would realize just how badly he had misjudged the situation. But for now, she sat patiently in her car, gathering evidence, remembering faces of witnesses, and mentally preparing the formal complaint that would change the department forever. The rain kept falling, washing away the tears on her cheek, but not the determination in her eyes. This incident wouldn't just be another statistic, it would become a catalyst for real change in the police department, and Officer Wilson was about to learn a hard lesson about power, prejudice, and consequences.